The revolution of talk radio.
Welcome to Spice of Life Health Choices. I'm Nancy Holbrook.
I'm Susan Dunbar.
And I'm Peggy Murphy, and we are here to inform,
educate,
and empower you to make your own decisions about your health. Tell us about our author today.
Okay, we're excited about Jeff Wilson is going to talk about his book, Irrational Medicine, the Antidepressant Crisis, and How to Avoid Unnecessary Behavioral Drugs. 30. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
You know, I'm going to just talk about Jeff for a second for the listeners. Jeff is a survivor of 23 years. 23 years. Sounds like I'm on psychiatric drugs. Of 23 years of psychiatric drug treatment. A former pharmaceutical industry executive and author of this book we were talking about. He has spent the vast majority of his career in the executive ranks of Fortune 500 companies. His last position working for the world's largest distributor of pharmaceuticals gave him an inside view of the medical industry. It's kind of ironic, Jeff, that here, when you got off your drugs, you left the pharmaceutical position that you were in.
Yeah, it is very ironic. But, you know, the universe has a way of making things like that happen.
Doesn't it, though? Nancy, you want to give him the first question?
I do, but, Jeff, I want to tell the listeners, I read your book, and I was very touched by all the work you did, and I just wanted you to know that, but I got to the end, and your transformation brought tears to my eyes. I just wanted everyone to know that. And anyway, but the question is...
But Nancy also cries at supermarket openings,
No,
Jeff.
I do not. I loved your book, okay?
We all did.
Okay, now, why don't you give us a brief history about your antidepressant usage?
Well, it basically started in 1980. My 18-year-old brother passed away of an aneurysm in the brain. And within 3 months of that, my parents divorced. And so at night, I found myself coming home to an empty house. You know, his parents were gone, and my brother was passed away, and my family was gone.
And you had another brother that had passed away earlier.
Yeah, but I didn't know him. He was the first child.
Okay.
He died when he was like 3 days old.
Okay.
So I'm the only surviving child of three. And at any rate, I went to my family doctor after a few months of this, and I complained that I was feeling bad. I was tired. I was just laying around watching television all the time. I had no interest in life. And he looked at me. He said, "Oh, well, you know, you're depressed." Now, keep in mind, in 1980, depression wasn't like it is today. You know, today it's almost the common cold of mental illness. Everybody knows about it. Everybody knows about the pills and so forth. Back then, that is very unknown. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, it's a biochemical imbalance in the brain, and we can have a pill here. We can give it to you, and it'll balance you out, and you'll be okay."
And your first pill was what?
Deserel.
Deserel, okay.
Yeah, that was Deserel, and it started out at a minimal dosage, you know, small dosage. And this is my family physician. Okay, so it wasn't a psychiatrist yet. And that went on for 3 or 4 years, and he kept upping the dosage of the Deserel, and finally got to the point where I was depressed again, and it just didn't seem to work anymore. And by work, what I meant was, you know, I had energy again. I was active. I was moving around and interested in life. And but eventually that all wore off. And so he said, "Well, you're at such a high dosage, I think you need to go see a psychiatrist." So that's when I started seeing a psychiatrist for my depression. And he tested me, gave me a 30-minute written test, and said, "Oh, yeah, you're depressed," and changed my medicine, and I forget what it was at that time, but I mentioned the specifics in the book. But anyway, that went on for a number of years, and it just was escalating dosages, different medicines. You know, I would be on one medicine for 2 or 3 years, and then the effectiveness would wear off, and they'd put me on a different medicine. And that just was repeated over and over and over. I went to numerous doctors, you know, as I moved around the country, and went to different doctors, and they listened to my background and looked at my records, and they would always change medicines and increase dosages. And then I found a doctor in Columbus who was supposed to be the best psychiatrist in the city.
Now, you were living at the time in Cincinnati or Dayton? I can't remember.
I started in Dayton, moved to Cincinnati. I was there for about 10 years.
Okay.
And then came up here to Columbus about 10 years ago.
All right.
And when I came up here to Columbus, I found this doctor, and he started me on multiple medicines, which is now very common. They call it polypharmacology, where they'll get more than one medicine because one of them just doesn't do the trick.
Well, heck no.
Jeff, were those like different antidepressant medications together?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, toward the end, I was on Wellbutrin and Effexor, which are both antidepressants. I was on Buspar, which is an anti-anxiety drug, because of the side effects of the antidepressants causing me to have anxiety. And all those drugs combined, the side effects of those caused me to be diagnosed with ADD. So the doctor put me on Ritalin, and then with the Ritalin in the mix, that caused me to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so I was on, 5 or 6 different medicines.
And you also were taking an anti-seizure medication because, Wellbutrin does, one of the side effects is seizures, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's called Depakote.
So at one point I counted you were on 6 or 7 medications. And what amazes me is that none of these doctors even thought, gee, maybe this is the very first time, maybe it's a side effect of the first drug. Instead, they just kept putting drugs on top of each other.
Right, exactly. That's exactly what happened. I was stuck in the medical model of treatment, which was you have a symptom, here's a drug. Rather than look at what the cause of it is, it's a symptom, well, here's the drug to cover up the symptom. And that's why I ended up with Ritalin and so forth.
Wow.
Well, what finally got you to change your mind about all those drugs that you were taking then?
Well, there were 2 scenarios, 2 things that happened that started to open my eyes. And one of them was it was December, and my doctor had gone to Florida, and I looked at my medication, and I figured out, well, I don't have enough to last me until he gets back. So I went ahead and halved all the dosages. And the funniest thing happened when I began to half the dosages, I began to feel better. And at this time, I was pretty bad. I mean, I was really bad. I had no energy. I had no interest in life. Even though I was on all these antidepressants, I was really depressed. But when I halved the dosage of the medicine, the energy began to come back, and my zest for life began to come back. And I went into the doctor when he finally got back in January, and I told him what I did, and he berated me. I mean, if you would have thought I had killed somebody. He just told me there's no way you should ever have done that. You should have called my backup and blah, blah, blah. And he just bowed his head down and wrote out new prescriptions.
And yet you were feeling better, though.
I was feeling better with less medicine.
Well, that makes a lot of sense for him to have you do that.
Yeah.
And
then the other scenario that happened was my father went through a 4-month ordeal where I literally had to take over being an advocate for his care. And I began to see how the medical profession kind of withholds information.
Kind of. Holy cow! The things that you went through with your dad.
Yeah. Well,
I got so angry during that part of the book.
Well, I hear you. I get that response from a lot of people, and it's a heck of a story. It could be a book in and of itself.
It could.
absolutely.
But if I had not stepped in and taken over the care for my dad, he would have been dead. There's no doubt in my mind about it.
You know what? It's interesting because Susan and I actually read the book to each other on our way to see my nephew and his wonderful wife and 2 wonderful sons in State College, Pennsylvania. And as we read that part of the book, and then the rest of the book, I said, it seemed to me, and I might be wrong, that when you had to go outside of yourself and look to take care of your father, because you were lucky to be functioning, son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here your father was, all of a sudden he was taken ill, and you were the one that had to step up because you had no brothers or sisters, and he had a wife who needed help, asked you to help. And all of a sudden you're in rescue mode.
Mm-hmm.
And you got your executive functioning to get the problems solved that were at the hospital in Dayton, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to Susan, here, he started to really function when he needed to help his dad.
Right.
And that almost seemed like a turning point in the book. Am I right, or am I just exaggerating?
Oh, no, that was absolutely the turning point in the book.
Yeah.
The situation where I backed off the medicine, I began to feel a little bit better, kind of raised a flag in my mind that said, maybe there's something wrong here. And then the situation where I had to save my dad's life, I had to take action to save my dad's life, was really the turning point, because what I did after that, after everything was over and he walked out of the hospital, I began to look and see my own situation, what was happening in my own life. A lot of times we'll do things for other people that we won't do for ourselves.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what happened to me. Because I'd never in my life had imagined that I could stand up to a doctor. You know, doctors and the way I was raised were superior, were well-trained, they were educated, they knew all the answers. You had to listen to your doctor.
Well, as you said, they were gods.
In my mind, yeah, they were at that time. And the situation with my dad, where I had to fire numerous doctors, I had to move into 3 different hospitals, and I saw how all their opinions differed, even though they supposedly had the same training. And if at any one time, if I had taken the wrong advice, or taken the wrong turn, my dad would have lost his life.
Right.
It's amazing.
And when I looked at that and I began to put 2 and 2 together, it was like, doctors are not God. They should be treated no more than hired help. You know, they have professional opinions, and that's what they are. They are opinions. And when I began to approach my life from that perspective, then I was able to stand up for myself and then go to my psychiatrist and say, look, I think there's something going on here.
Back to our guest, Jeff. Jeff, I just want to mention one more thing about patient advocacy, because you proved to be quite the advocate for your father. But what amazes me is you went to a very popular clinic that people go to for the very best care. And you did at first finally get your father diagnosed correctly at the Cleveland Clinic, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay. However, everybody listening, and for those of you who know me, you know that I've gone through an awful lot with my father, mother, and brother all going through cancer and being in the hospital. I think a total of 168 days I've dealt with the hospital and nursing home rigmarole and the lack of care at the best hospitals. And even at the best hospital, I mean, here's Jeff and his stepmother living in Columbus and Dayton, and the father and husband is up in the Cleveland Clinic. And at one point they said they would have a sitter for your father, and he fell out of bed 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. Yeah, he needed a sitter because after his initial heart surgery in Dayton, he had a stroke, and so he wasn't coherent all the time. And he would, when we weren't around, he would try to get out of bed.
Well, sure.
And we insisted on a sitter, and they said, oh, yeah, we'll have one there. And one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, I get a call, says, your dad's fallen. So I hop in the car, drive all the way to Cleveland, 2 hours away. And sure enough, he had not had a sitter, and none had been assigned to him or anything.
Jeff, is that the place where your dad was on that one drug? Was that Haldol?
Haldol.
And it was keeping him in a almost comatose state or something?
Well, he was on Haldol the whole time. I went back and looked at his records, and the hospitals use Haldol, and especially nursing homes use Haldol frequently as more or less a chemical straitjacket to control patients. And because he had the stroke, you couldn't reason with him too much sometimes. And I noticed every time that he would get upset or anything, they'd shoot him with Haldol. And yeah, he was on it in both hospitals in Dayton, and he was on it in Cleveland, in the Cleveland Clinic.
And then back at the nursing home when he came. And for those listening, this Haldol you have got to watch what your loved ones are being given, and you ask questions, and then what you do?
Ask some more questions.
Yes.
And so make sure you know what's going on and what the side effects are. Jeff experienced a doctor who absolutely lied to him in front of his father when he asked the doctor a question. The doctor lied because he hadn't even seen the chart yet, and the nurse tried to correct the doctor in front of the doctor, and the doctor got all ticked off when the doctor was wrong.
Yeah.
So you guys, no matter what, check some more as to what's going on. And you're the patient advocate if you have the authority to say, I don't want my father on Haldol, because it just makes you so lethargic. It makes it easy for them to work with.
Right, because they don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and let me cover what happened on the Haldol situation. We had him moved back to a rehabilitation facility in Dayton, which was really also a nursing home. And I went in there day after day. And most of the times he was laying on his right side facing the wall. And I began to feel really guilty. Why on earth did I work so hard to save my father's life if he's going to live like this? He was basically a vegetable. He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't get up and go to the bathroom. He had no interest in life. He barely knew who any of us were. And I was feeling really guilty for that. And then one day we noticed that he was still being given Haldol. And when we asked the doctor why, he said, well, that's what he came from the Cleveland Clinic with, so we just kept him on that regimen. And so we insisted that he be removed from the Haldol. 2 days later, without any Haldol in his system, I walked in. He's up, he's walking, he's talking, he's feeding himself, he's going to the bathroom. He's doing everything that he should be doing, at this point in his recovery. And it was all because the Haldol. Now, Haldol is part of the same family of psychiatric drugs as antidepressants. And Haldol is used quite frequently with schizophrenia. So that's why I really pointed out in the book, because I don't know if you're familiar with Andrea Yates. She
Yes.
killed her 5 children
Oh, yeah.
in Texas. That woman at the time was on Wellbutrin, Effexor, which are both antidepressants, and Haldol. Okay?
Gee.
And it's not been brought out in court, but I've been in communication with her lawyer over if they ever retry this woman, they really need to focus on the drug issues.
Oh, wow.
Because she was given more than the recommended dosages of Wellbutrin and Effexor. And I don't know how much Haldol she was on, but it was a pretty large
amazing.
amount.
And here we are so quick to judge when we hear that someone has injured a family member, especially a child. We are so quick to judge.
I want to come back because you were talking about Andrea Yates and killing her children. My husband, and this was about 10 years ago, was involved in a class action suit. The man in Louisville, Kentucky went into McDonald's and he shot and killed like 20 people. And he was on a particular antidepressant. And what they did, the company who made that drug, and I won't mention specifics here, did settle out of court as long as they did not bring up that there could have been involvement with this drug causing this.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a huge settlement on that, and I don't know all the particulars. But anyway, back to you. I can't.
Well, let me. While you touched on that, I want to bring that point up. That is a very common thing happening today. There's a lot of lawsuits being brought, an incredible amount of lawsuits being brought, and the drug companies settle these lawsuits. They don't let them go to court. They settle them with the proviso of a gag order. There are multis of millions of dollars being paid out by the drug companies right now in those very scenarios. I could list you off 100 of them that are going on right now. As a matter of fact, did you know that? I'm sure you've heard of all the school shootings that have gone on.
Oh, absolutely.
There is not one school shooting that did not involve the use of antidepressants.
Wow.
Okay, that's a very unknown fact. They certainly don't want that out. As a matter of fact, the kids who actually did the shootings at Columbine, recently there was a court case where the drug companies were sued by the shooters, by the people who committed the crime.
Oh my gosh.
They sued the drug companies. The drug companies settled out of court. Okay. Now you didn't hear about that in the media because that's not good business, but that's a fact.
Well, I think we are seeing the end of with all this stuff with the drug companies coming out in public, and the truth is finally getting here, and that's why I like our show, because we're bringing a lot of this out. But anyway, Jeff, you've been through so much, you were on so much. How did you finally start getting off of all of this stuff, all the antidepressants?
Well, I finally went and got a second opinion, and that's when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And when I walked out of that psychiatrist's office, I was just terrible. I mean, it was like I just wanted my life to end because I saw no hope at the end of the tunnel. And a friend of mine said, "Have you ever thought about alternative medicine? Have you ever thought about alternative healing methods?" And I didn't even know what that was. And so I started seeing a homeopathic physician, and she gave me a remedy, and I began to feel a little bit better. Then we began to talk about how to get off the drugs, and I began to feel a little bit better about that. Then I began to seek like energy workers, body workers. I went to a massage therapist here in Columbus who is just spectacular, and she began to educate me on that whole part of my being that I wasn't even aware of. And I began to see a Reiki practitioner. I began to see a hypnotherapist. And so all these people combined helped me begin to deal with my depression and begin to deal with the issues in my life. I also did a lot of personal growth trainings, and I list those in the book, that each one of those helped me deal with a particular piece in my life. When I say I went to the doctor in 1980 and I got this pill, I was depressed. There's no doubt about it. And there's a whole series of reasons for my depression, and I had to deal with those reasons. And I used all these alternative methods in order to do that.
Well, you know what amazed me is the whole first first two-thirds of the book, I'm thinking, nobody's talking to him about nutrition. And you finally sought out Dr. Pam Popper, who's a nutritionist in Columbus, who I happen to know. And she also helped in a big way.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, that was there were several things that were just keys to my healing, and one of them was nutrition. One of the things that she put me on right away was a shake in the morning, and I still do this religiously. I do not miss this. And what it includes is brewer's yeast to supply me with all the B vitamins my body requires. And one thing that can cause panic attacks and anxiety is a lack of B vitamins in your system.
Yes.
The other thing is, what is it? There's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Oh, flax seeds, omega-3 fatty acids. You have to have omega-3 fatty acids in your diet for your brain to work properly. And I really notice a huge difference when I don't have my shake. I mean, I have to have this. I need the omega-3 fatty acids, and I need the B vitamins.
That's so important for the listeners to hear, because for those of you who are listening who are either contemplating some options for yourself, I do want to talk about, and we're going to talk about this later, about alternatives as far as diet, but the brewer's yeast with the B vitamins and the omega-3s are so important. And we're going to talk more about that. I also want to talk about your two sons and what they meant to you and how they prevented you from doing something dastardly. We're going to talk about that after our quick break. Hang on, with Jeff Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book, Irrational Medicine, The Antidepressant Crisis, and How to Avoid Unnecessary Behavioral Drugs. He should know he spent 23 years on this crap, and he got out from under that tunnel. All right, Jeff,
Peggy,
back to your book. What I think is interesting is that a friend told you something very important to keep you from suicide. Please tell us what that was.
Yeah, actually, he was a therapist that I was seeing at the time. I had just lost my job because I'd gotten in a cycle where, and this is back in '94, I'd gotten in a cycle where the medicine was not working as well as I thought it should. And my doctor kept trying things, and she put me on a medicine for 3 or 4 months and then switched it out. And at that time I went through Prozac and Wellbutrin and Effexor and a couple other medicines. And at the same time, I found out my wife was having an affair. And so I went through several months of terrible performance at work. And up until that time, I prided myself on my job and what I had done. And that was where all my self-esteem was in my job. So I lost my wife. I lost my job. I moved into an apartment. And I'm sitting in the apartment contemplating the logistics of putting a gun in my mouth and pulling the trigger, because everything I'd ever wanted or worked for was gone. And when I realized how insane that thought was, I called up my therapist and went and saw him the next morning. And he sat there and told me, he said, if you commit suicide, you're giving your children permission to deal with their problems the exact same way.
Wow.
And right then, it was like a light switch went off. And from that day forward, committing suicide was never an option, okay? Now, if I'd been hit by a bus, or if I had had a massive heart attack, or any other reason that my life would be taken from me, I would have been happy. I'd have been so happy on these 23 years on these drugs. I just wanted my life to be over, but suicide was no longer an option.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. It's a tough subject to talk about. However, a friend of mine, when I was working in Toledo for an insurance agency, wonderful agent there, he was 28 years old, and when he was like 10, he found his mother who had committed suicide. Not only did he commit suicide when he was 31, but his brother committed suicide also.
Yeah.
So when I read that, it was riveting, because I happen to have a grandmother, a grandfather who committed suicide, and what a ripple effect.
Yeah.
What a ripple effect. So interesting. Susan, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to know, like, after you broke free of all these drugs and you went on a quest to find out what happened to you, well, what did you discover through this process about the pharmaceuticals?
Well, and that's a great question, but let me finish one thing about the suicide while we're on this subject.
Go ahead.
Back last October, the FDA finally announced that there's enough proof to say that that these drugs cause suicidal ideation in teenagers. I can't tell you how many phone calls and emails I've gotten from parents of teenagers who have lost their child because they got on these drugs, and a couple days later or a week or so later they committed suicide because the drugs literally just drove them that way. I'm convinced that it also causes suicidal ideation in adults.
Now explain what ideation is.
Suicidal thoughts. Just wanting it to be over with, because the drugs, actually some of the side effects of the drugs are depression and suicidal thoughts. Now, explain to me how a drug that's supposed to fix these things can cause these things. I mean, that's one of the things I discovered, and now I'm going to answer your other question. That's one of the things I discovered when I turned around and looked back at the situation, and I had a unique vantage point being inside the industry. And I began to notice how these drugs are marketed and how we're really convinced that we have a problem. Depression is real, but it's not a disease like we've been led to believe.
That was really important.
You know, if you could hang on for another segment, we would so appreciate it. Otherwise, Philip won't listen to us. So, can you hold on until after the break?
Our friend Philip.
We're going to hear the news.
Okay.
And Jeff Wilson, who wrote a fantastic book about his 23 years dealing with depression and the pharmaceutical drugs that went along with it, and how he got out of that spiraling downfall, is absolutely fascinating. So hang on to your seats, gang. Hang with us for just a few minutes. After the news, we'll be back with Jeff Wilson. You're listening to Spice of Life Health Choices with Susan, Peggy, and Nancy on 1530 WCKY, the revolution of talk radio.
Under the spotlight of truth, join the revolution.
1530 WCKY.
The revolution of talk radio.
Welcome back. You're listening to Spice of Life Health Choices. I'm Nancy Holbrook.
I'm Susan Dunbar.
I'm Peggy Murphy, and we are here to inform,
Educate,
And empower people to take responsibilities for their health. And speaking of empowerment, our guest, Jeff Wilson, who went through 23 years of depression and antidepressant medicines, and he is here with us telling us how he empowered himself. And Jeff, I am so glad to be talking to you.
Well, let's go back, Jeff, and talk. You know, you were just getting into the pharmaceutical part of what your journey.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, like I said, I was a unique perspective because I was sitting inside the industry, and I began to really look at how drugs are developed, how drugs are approved, how drugs are marketed, and it's quite a business. It's an incredible business. Antidepressants alone, their market last year was over $10 billion.
Wow.
Whoa.
B as in boy as in billion.
Billion, yeah.
Wow.
So you figure if they pay out, a few $100 million in lawsuits, that's a heck of a return on investment. And then they're
Sure
more
is.
than willing to pay that out to keep people quiet, just so they can keep peddling their products. One of the biggest things I found was that there's been no studies done that last more than about 6 weeks on the effectiveness of these drugs. Yet they're prescribed for months and years at a time, and in my case, 23 years at a time. But they've never been proven to be effective. And quite frankly, the drug companies do not want to do any more studies. They don't want to do long-term studies because when they find out the results, they know that they can be held criminally liable for that. Just like the cigarette companies, how they did the studies on nicotine, and then they suppressed those results and so forth. And that's what the drug companies will find, and they know that they don't even want to go there and do that.
There was just an article in this last week's USA Today that talked about pharmaceutical companies are not living up to their bargain with the FDA. The FDA is approving these pharmaceutical drugs, yet they are not doing what their due diligence in following up with the control studies that they're supposed to.
Right.
Half the school, it goes on and on. Harvard researchers sent surveys to the nation's 122 accredited medical schools to gauge what kind of standards exist between researchers and sponsors, and all but 15 responded they were afraid to.
Yeah.
And I was talking to some friends earlier today saying they're running studies for what benefits them.
Exactly.
And it may be a 6-month study, but once it goes to 12 months, if it's and I'm not talking about antidepressants, I'm just talking about drugs in
general, yeah.
In general, and if the studies come out not in their favor, are they going to publish them?
Right. Well, that's what people don't realize is that the people who are doing this, that build, control, execute, and then deliver the results of the studies are the drug companies. The FDA doesn't do that anymore. They stopped doing that back in 1982 when the first President Bush changed the way the FDA was run. Today, the drug companies deliver the results of their studies along with a check to the FDA for approval.
Wow.
And that's how it works.
And people don't realize they pay the FDA to get an approved drug.
Yeah.
And here I thought the FDA was supposed to be watching out for us as consumers.
They're our
Yeah.
watchdog. Who's watching the dog?
Yeah, the FDA is not watching out for anybody, and that's evident of that is the Vioxx fiasco
sure.
we've just gone through. You know, that drug's been on the market for quite a while. The FDA, and here's the other thing is the FDA knows some of this is going on because they have a huge database of side effects, but there's nobody combing the database. There's nobody researching it. There's nobody pushing to get these drugs off the market because there's just no incentive to, because they're being paid by the drug companies. You know.
Jeff, the other thing is, wait a minute. Now I lost my train of thought.
Aren't doctors watching out for?
Yeah.
That's what bothers me. Is that the doctors, like your doctors, they weren't listening to you.
Well, what doctors listen to? Well, the other thing is, let me back up. Here's how the system works. I'm going to give you a really quick synopsis. Drug companies or pharmaceutical companies fund the major medical schools, the big medical schools, so that they can get their message into the textbooks. Doctors are indoctrinated with pharmaceutical propaganda from the minute they enter medical school. Once they leave medical school, the vast majority of a doctor's education post college is provided by the pharmaceutical companies. And I took my wife to a gynecologist a few months ago. I was sitting in the waiting room, and I counted 5 pharmaceutical reps that walked in that office within a 30-minute period. The pharmaceutical companies are just blanketing doctors with propaganda, with free trips, with education, what they call education, but it's really sales promotion. And they're just bombarding them with free samples and freebies and all kinds of other stuff in order to get doctors to push their product. Doctors, and I'm not knocking the doctor, but they're busy people, but they are taking what they're being told, most doctors are, by the pharmaceutical companies, hook, line, and sinker, and just being effective salesmen for the drug companies.
And Jeff, you also said, wait a minute, I am having this. What is going on with
You have
me?
a brain hiccup.
I have a brain hiccup, but it's really important. I have to tell you this. Depression. You had said earlier before we go in on the break that it's not a disease.
Yeah, well,
that's a big one. But
yeah.
they make you feel like it's a disease,
right?
Just like menopause.
Well, yeah, exactly. All the medical literature says depression is a disease, and that's the way that the drug companies are marketing their product, by saying, here's a disease and here's a product to fix it. When in reality, depression is a natural part of being a human being. For example, in 1980, I lost my family. I lost my parents to a divorce. I lost my brother to a death. I was grieving. I had every right to be where I was. But rather than letting me sit in that and work my way through it, the doctor gave me a pill which covered it up. And that's what these pills do. They just cover up things. They don't fix anything. If they really fix something, then I should never have been as depressed as I was when I was going through a divorce and lost my job and everything. But the pills didn't fix anything. What they did was they blunted my natural emotions. They blunted who I was as a human being. And for 23 years, I didn't know who I was. And so one of the big things was when I came off these drugs, I had to figure out who I was, what I liked in life, what I wanted to do with my life. I had big questions to answer. And the drugs emotionally blunted me.
So, if there's one thing that somebody had to know about getting off the antidepressants, Jeff, what would that be?
Well, the biggest thing is that when you come off of them, you're going to get depressed. It's documented fact that they cause the very disease they're supposed to cure. When you start coming off the drugs, your body's going through a readjustment period, and you'll go through a terrible depression. My doctors would see that. I tried several times throughout the 23 years to come off the drugs, and they would see that happen, and then they would say, "Oh, see, you got a biochemical imbalance. That proves that you're going to have these drugs for the rest of your life." And that was a fallacy. What it was the drug withdrawal that I was going through. And so if somebody's coming off the drugs or wants to come off the drugs, the biggest problem is that you're going to go through this withdrawal period. In my case, it lasted for 7 months.
Wow. And you
Whoa.
were so
Yeah.
patient to write it out, because the one main thing we have to go to a break is that if people, please do not get off your drugs just
Right.
Right.
real quickly. Go to a specialist that can help you wean yourself off those drugs and stay with it, because it took you 7 months. And my goodness, I so salute you for that. God bless you. We got to take a quick break. You can stay with us, can't you?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Because we have a few callers, and we want to get to those too. So if you could stay with us, we had 2 callers that just wanted to comment what a wonderful show this was. There was 2 callers in a row that said, we really appreciate this information, and reiterated that you need to come off these drugs when you do very slowly, because they're titrated. Is that right? Is that the word?
Titrate it.
Is that the word I'm looking for? Yeah, okay. Titrated down. Whatever she said. Now,
Okay.
Nancy, you had a quick question.
I have a quick question going back to, you're getting off the antidepressants and what you said. I looked up a lot of oh, wait a minute. Before I say this, we are not doctors. Okay, none of us are doctors. We're just people trying to empower ourselves and transform into joy.
And
okay?
give information.
And give information. And I'm not bashing people, and I'm not telling people don't use them, because I've used an antidepressant, but I'll tell you about that later. But in the PDR, the physician's desk reference, all of them say number one side effect is depression. And then I thought I read this in your book, and suicidal tendencies, but I thought I read this in your book about that most of these studies that were done, they found out that the antidepressants were a lot placebo. Did you tell that in your book, or did I dream that?
Well, no, one of the studies that was used in the Prozac approval process showed that 40% of the people in the study got better on a placebo.
Wow.
And that was one of the ones that was used for approval of the drug.
Oh.
40.
Remember, they hold back the ones that don't work, so that was the best that they could offer.
Oh, that's amazing. I knew I read
Now,
that.
speaking of holding back, we did have a caller that talked about Wellbutrin. And I know somebody else that's been on Wellbutrin. And this person who called in said that she wouldn't have gotten better had she not been on Wellbutrin. And so she must have a crystal ball. Good for her. But you mentioned that when you're under the guise of the shadow of depression, you're looking for the magic pill.
Right.
And so you do feel better for a while.
Right.
Please expand on that so that people understand this whole malaise of the brain.
Well, it's part of it is placebo. I mean, you know, your doctor tells you you will get better,
Right.
so you take the pill and you will get better. And in my case, you know, when I first started on it, I got better. You know, within the first few months, I felt great. I felt the best I'd felt in many years. But after a while, you know, the pill begins to really work on your body, because really pharmaceuticals are poisons. You know, that anytime you put something like a chemical in your body, it changes who you are chemically. And so over time, the pills will make you feel worse, and that's what happened to me. You know, in 23 years, I felt terrible toward the end. I mean, I had just wished that life was over, because I just had no energy. I had nothing, and these pills began to not work anymore.
So that's an excellent explanation, Jeff. And we've got a caller, and his name is Tim from Cincinnati. Hi, Tim. Do you have a question for Jeff?
Yes, I do.
Go for it.
Jack, I was curious as to whether or not you studied anything about a lot of the discoveries and machines that have been developed, I think, originally for good reasons, but have been taken over by the military, electromagnetic energy, pulsed wave, things like that can induce schizophrenia or manipulate moods in people to the point where they think they would need a psychotropic drug, which would only make the situation worse.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that at all? Any of the weapons that are used to drive people crazy, like HARP?
Yeah, I've heard of those. I honestly have not studied them, but from what I understand, you know, the theory is not that far off. I mean, it's very possible to do that. I mean, electroshock therapy is still being used out there, and it induces electricity into the brain. You know, one of the things my doctor recommended was, and this is one of the things that just, in retrospect, was a red flag. You know, he told me, he said, you know, the longer I tend to treat people with these drugs, the worse they tend to be. the depression just gets worse and worse and worse. So if you don't improve relatively soon, we may want to investigate electroshock therapy. So, I mean, yeah, and electroshock therapy is being shown to actually cause more problems than it ever fixes.
Yes, that's my whole point. I'm thinking that's why a lot of the publications that I'm looking at by Mr. Becker, by Don R. Johnson, Microwaves and Behavior, March 1975, things have been studied, I think, pertaining to mind control since the 50s. I think a lot of things that we might see in the movies as entertainment are actually things that they do have and things that have been used. There are many documented cases. One of the people revealing this type of information that has taken place in academia and hospitals across the country, private and veterans hospitals, is Alex Constantine. Is the author of several books, CIA Mind Control Operations in America, Psychic Dictatorship. So these types of things, I think, have been done to the public without their knowing in a way to sort of fund or keep the pharmaceutical companies in business.
Okay, Tim, well, those are interesting
It could be another
insights.
show.
It
could be a whole
nother
nother show.
Thanks for your call, Tim. So let's get back to your book, because we could go into conspiracy theories. That could be
That's my favorite.
Yeah, Len Horowitz can come back, and I can call him a nutball again.
No, was not.
He wasn't.
Thank you. I don't think he was either.
Wait a minute. About conspiracy things. I read this because I happen to believe in conspiracy things, Jeff. And I heard this from Sherry Tenpenny said this, and she said that the only one who doesn't believe in conspiracy theories are the ones who don't read about them. So there you go. Okay, never mind. Go ahead.
Well, let me touch on this kind of a conspiracy theory, but this is, I mean, you can check this out all over the place. And I came from a conference in Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago where we really focused on this, and it's the teen screen program for the government. The pharmaceutical industry has really pushed the Bush administration. And by the way, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the largest contributors to President Bush's campaign. And anyway, he implemented a program in Texas called Teen Screen.
Now you're saying teen, T-E-E?
T-E-E-N.
Okay.
Screen. Yeah, and and what it is, it's basically, and they started this in Texas, it's basically to screen all school-age children from kindergarten all the way through high school for depression. And then provide them with the appropriate treatment. And you can, and in quotes, it's drugs. I can guarantee you that. Well, now it's half of the program. It's a federal program now. It's called the New Freedom Commission on Mental Health, and it's been funded in part. There's $20 million already allocated to this. It's already begun in the state of Florida, and it is to screen all of our children. And I can guarantee you that if your child is diagnosed with depression, they will be treated with drugs. There'll be no, you have the option or anything like that. That's one of the things we focused on in this conference, is because in the bill it states that it's mandatory treatment.
I think that's horrible.
And this is being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry, and it's being done through the Bush administration.
I'm getting depressed.
I know.
So I'm going to have to go back to the last part of your book as to how to get out of this. This is America. Right?
Yes.
This is America.
Yes.
You know where I think they should put their money is to take out the soda pop machines.
Oh, really?
And replace
absolutely.
them with water machines and pH water.
Yeah.
That's good pH water. Nancy had another question.
I have a lot of questions, but my main thing is go back to how, as you were getting off these drugs for 7 months, you were depressed, and when did you start coming around to feeling better, Jeff? And was there a specific thing that happened to you?
Yeah, and I actually call it my second birthday. It was March 1st of 2004.
Aww. I was born on March 3rd, so that's neat.
I wasn't.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I had stopped the drugs 7 months before, and I literally went through 7 months of withdrawal. I mean, just terrible time of feeling bad and depressed and flu-like symptoms and just, many times I thought about going back on the drugs, and thank God I had friends that were supporting me and said, you really just fight it out. Hold on. Just keep going. And then March 1st, 2004, I woke up. And for the first time in 23 years, I actually wanted to live.
Oh.
I mean, it was that obvious. It was that different of a way of being. And so I spent the next few weeks just kind of wondering, is this for real? Is this going to stay? Am I going to be okay? And I went out and I got my motorcycle fixed. It had been in disrepair for about 3 years. One of the things I had noted, going back and writing the book, one of the things I noticed was that my life had drained away from me. The more drugs I took, the bigger the dosages, the longer I was on the drugs, the less and less I did, the less and less I was involved in life. And my motorcycle was a great example. It was something that I had loved for many years, and it fell in disrepair about 3 years ago, and I never got it fixed. And it just sat in the garage and collected dust. And I can look at the increase in my dosages of drugs and relate that directly to withdrawn from life. So anyway, in March, I got that fixed. I went out and I bought the chocolate Labrador puppy that I always wanted since I was, since I was a little boy. And I'd done things that I wanted to do. I got involved in life again, and it was a tremendous time. And it was unreal. It was like being born again.
I do applaud you for the work.
Oh.
And we're so glad that you wrote the book because it's a very important book. Susan, you had a question.
Well, I was just going to say, would it be fair to say, Jeff, that your book could be used by people taking antidepressants or by anyone who just wanted a better life?
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wrote it. I focused on the antidepressants because that's what they call a marketing hook. But really what it is it's a roadmap to emotional healing. We all have things in our lives that are causing us pain and that we may not even be aware of. And it's a map or it's a book that you can pick up, do what I did, and get the results that I got.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking of something, and along the lines of what you said about, at first these drugs helped you, and you felt really good. I had an 78-year-old aunt who came to see me, and she's really bubbly and cute and sweet, and she told me that she was on an antidepressant for 3 years, and now it doesn't work, and she was in tremendous amount of emotional pain. And that's that 78, not that that's that old, but I felt so sorry for her. So my thing was, if you need an antidepressant, if it's going to get you over the hump or a pain pill or whatever, use it, but look at the causes while you're on it so you can make your life better, so you can transform.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the things that I really got from your book.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's excellent. Jeff, you have been a wonderful guest. I'm so glad that you came. And Jeffrey, we tip our hat to you, and we so appreciate you being here. You were wonderful.
You were wonderful.
My pleasure.
And we
Thank you,
hope maybe
Jeff.
that we can have you back in the fall. We're trying to line up some guests in the fall. Would you be willing to come back?
Anytime.
Jeffrey, thank you. You'll be hearing from us. You have a great night now.
Okay, thanks.